Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your leadership on this over this entire Congress. It's been a real pleasure to work with you. Thanks to our witnesses for being here. I don't really have much to add to Senator Blumenthal's outstanding opening statement, other than just to observe that we have had many executives sit where our witnesses today are sitting, many avid proponents of this AI revolution that we're in the midst of. And we've heard a lot of promises to this subcommittee from those executives, who I might just point out always seem to have a very significant financial interest in what they're saying, be that as it may. But they have given us all kinds of rosy predictions. AI is going to be wonderful for this country. It's going to be fantastic for the workers of this country. It's going to be amazing for normal workaday Americans. Well, I think today's hearing is particularly interesting and particularly important because today we start to test those promises. We have in front of us folks who've been inside those companies, who have worked on these technologies, who have seen them firsthand. And I might just observe, don't have quite the vested interest in painting that rosy picture and cheerleading in the same way that some of these other executives have. So I want to particularly thank you for being here today, our witnesses. Thank you for being willing to speak up, and thank you for being willing to give the American people a window into what's actually happening with this technology. I think the testimony you're about to offer is so important. And I think it will help us realize, understand where this technology is, what the challenges are that we are facing, and also I hope help us, as Senator Blumenthal alluded to, legislate in a way that will actually protect the American people, which is our charge in all of this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Hawley. I haven't asked Senator Durbin whether he would like to make an opening statement. Evidently not. So let me just introduce the witnesses. Helen Toner is a policy researcher at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where her work focuses on AI safety, U.S.-China competition, and national security. She previously worked as a senior research analyst at Open Philanthropy, where she advised policymakers and grant makers on AI policy and strategy. Alongside her work at CSET, she served on OpenAI's nonprofit board of directors from 2021 to 2023. David Evan Harris is a chancellor's public scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, and faculty member at the Haas School of Business, where he teaches courses on artificial intelligence, ethics, social movements, and social media and civic technology. In addition to teaching, he conducts research on AI and governance and serves as an advisor to the California Initiative for Technology and Democracy and a number of other organizations focused on technology and policy. Mr. Harris has advised the White House, U.S. Congress, European Union, United Nations, NATO, and the California legislature about technology policy. His writings and commentary have been featured by publications too numerous to mention here. Margaret Mitchell is a computer scientist who works on the ethical development of AI systems within the tech industry. She has held researcher positions at Microsoft and Google, and her pioneering work on model cards, now common across the tech industry, has been recognized by the Secretary of Defense, at that point Ash Carter, as an outstanding innovation for public good. She currently works at Hugging Face as a researcher and chief ethics scientist, driving forward work on ML data processing, responsible AI development, AI ethics, and she's appearing today in her personal capacity. William Saunders worked at OpenAI for 3 years on the alignment team, which later became the super alignment team, researching techniques to help humans understand and control AI systems. He resigned in February 2024, concerned that OpenAI was not adequately preparing for the advanced AI systems the company is trying to build. So as Senator Hawley very, very aptly said, you are insiders who have the courage to come forward, and we are very grateful to you. As is our custom, I would ask you to rise, and I'll administer the oath. Do you swear that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Very good. Thank you. We'll just begin and go down the panel, beginning with Ms. Toner.
Chair Blumenthal, Ranking Member Hawley, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I want to start by commending you on the depth and sustained focus that this subcommittee is bringing to the many and varied challenges and opportunities that we face with AI. My work has focused on AI policy for the last 8 years, with an emphasis on national security, US-China competition, and AI safety. In 2019, I moved to Washington to help found CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University, which has since grown to be a highly respected source of analysis on AI policy issues. While working full-time at CSET, I also spent 2.5 years serving on OpenAI's nonprofit board from 2021 until the widely covered events of last November. Today, I'll be drawing on my research at CSET, my experiences on the board, and my extensive relationships with and interactions with AI researchers and executives from the years that I've worked in this space. The title of this hearing is Oversight of AI, Insiders' Perspectives, and the biggest disconnect that I see between AI insider perspectives and public perceptions of AI companies is when it comes to the idea of artificial general intelligence, or AGI. This term, AGI, isn't well defined, but it's generally used to mean AI systems that are roughly as smart or capable as a human. In public and policy conversations, talk of human-level AI is often treated as either science fiction or marketing hype. But many top AI companies, including OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, are treating building AGI as an entirely serious goal, and a goal that many people inside those companies think they might reach in 10 or 20 years, and some believe could be as close as 1 to 3 years away. More to the point, many of these same people believe that if they succeed in building computers that are as smart as humans, or perhaps far smarter than humans, that technology will be, at a minimum, extraordinarily disruptive, and at a maximum could lead to literal human extinction. The companies in question often say that it's too early for any regulation because the science of how AI works and how to make it safe is too nascent. I'd like to restate that in different words. They're saying, we don't have good science of how these systems work or how to tell when they'll be smarter than us. We don't have good science for how to make sure they won't cause massive harm. But don't worry, the main factors driving our decisions are profit incentives and unrelenting market pressure to move faster than our competitors. So we promise we're being extra, extra safe. Whatever these companies say about it being too early for any regulation, the reality is that billions of dollars are being poured into building and deploying increasingly advanced AI systems, and these systems are affecting hundreds of millions of people's lives, even in the absence of scientific consensus about how they work or what will be built next. So I would argue that a wait-and-see approach to policy is not an option. I want to be clear. I don't know how long we have to prepare for smarter-than-human AI, and I don't know how hard it will be to control it and ensure that it's safe. As I'm sure the committee has heard 1,000 times, AI doesn't just bring risks. It also has the potential to raise living standards, help solve global challenges, and empower people around the world. If the story were simply that this technology is bad and dangerous, then our job would be much simpler. The challenge we face is figuring out how to proactively make good policy despite immense uncertainty and expert disagreement about how quickly AI will progress and what dangers will arise along the way. The good news is that there are light-touch, adaptive policy measures we can adopt today that can both be helpful if we do see powerful AI systems soon, and also be helpful with many other AI policy issues that I'm sure we'll be discussing today. I want to briefly highlight 6 policy building blocks that I describe in more detail in my written testimony. First, we should be implementing transparency requirements for developers of high-stakes AI systems. We should be making major research investments in how to measure and evaluate AI, as well as how to make it safe. We should be supporting the development of a rigorous third-party audit ecosystem, bolstering whistleblower protections for employees of AI companies, increasing technical expertise in government, and clarifying how liability for AI harms should be allocated. These measures are really basic first steps that would in no way impede further innovation in AI. This kind of policy is about laying some minimal, common-sense groundwork to help us get a handle on AI harms we're already seeing, and also set us up to identify and respond to new developments in AI over time. This is not a technology we can manage with any single piece of legislation, but we're long overdue to implement some of these basic building blocks as a starting point. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Ms. Toner. Mr. Saunders.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Hawley, and distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to address this committee. For 3 years, I worked as a member of technical staff at OpenAI. Companies like OpenAI are working towards building artificial general intelligence, AGI. They are raising billions of dollars towards this goal. OpenAI's charter defines AGI as highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at most economically valuable work. This means AI systems that could act on their own over long periods of time and do most jobs that humans can do. AI companies are making rapid progress towards building AGI. A few days before this hearing, OpenAI announced a new system, GPT-01, that passed significant milestones, including one that was personally significant for me. When I was in high school, I spent years training for a prestigious international computer science competition. OpenAI's new system leaps from failing to qualify to winning a gold medal, doing better than me in an area relevant to my own job. There are still significant gaps to close, but I believe it is plausible that an AGI system could be built in as little as 3 years. AGI would cause significant changes to society, including radical changes to the economy and employment. AGI could also cause catastrophic harm via systems autonomously conducting cyber attacks or assisting in the creation of novel biological weapons. OpenAI's new AI system is the first system to show steps towards biological weapons risk, as it is capable of helping experts in planning to reproduce a known biological threat. Without rigorous testing, developers might miss this kind of dangerous capability. While OpenAI has pioneered aspects of this testing, they've also repeatedly prioritized speed of deployment over rigor. I believe there is a real risk they will miss important, dangerous capabilities in future AI systems. AGI will also be a valuable target for theft, including by foreign adversaries of the United States. While OpenAI publicly claims to take security seriously, their internal security was not prioritized. When I was at OpenAI, there were long periods of time where there were vulnerabilities that would have allowed me or hundreds of other employees at the company to bypass access controls and steal the company's most advanced AI systems, including GPT-4. No one knows how to ensure that AGI systems will be safe and controlled. Current AI systems are trained by human supervisors, giving them a reward when they appear to be doing the right thing. We will need new approaches when handling systems that can find novel ways to manipulate their supervisors or hide misbehavior until deployed. The super alignment team at OpenAI was tasked with developing these approaches, but ultimately we had to figure out as we went along, a terrifying prospect when catastrophic harm is possible. Today, that team no longer exists. Its leaders and many key researchers resigned after struggling to get the resources they needed to be successful. OpenAI will say that they are improving. I and other employees who resigned doubt they will be ready in time. This is true not just with OpenAI. The incentives to prioritize rapid deployment apply to the entire industry. This is why a policy response is needed. My fellow witnesses and I may have different specific concerns with the AI industry, but I believe we can find common ground in addressing them. If you want insiders to communicate about problems within AI companies, you need to make such communication safe and easy. That means a clear point of contact and legal protections for whistleblowing employees. Regulation must also prioritize requirements for third-party testing, both before and after deployment. Results from these tests must be shared. Creating an independent oversight organization and mandated transparency requirements, as in Senator Blumenthal and Senator Hawley's proposed framework, would be important steps towards these goals. I resigned from OpenAI because I lost faith that by themselves they will make responsible decisions about AGI. If any organization builds technology that imposes significant risks on everyone, the public must be involved in deciding how to avoid or minimize those risks. That was true before AI, it needs to be true today with AI. Thank you for your work on these issues, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Saunders. By the way, I'm going to ask that all of your written testimony be made a part of the record, so I know you've abbreviated your remarks, as I expect the others will do as well. Your full remarks will be part of the record without objection. Mr. Harris.
Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Hawley, and members of the committee. It is an honor to appear before you today to discuss the harms and risks of artificial intelligence. It is particularly heartening to see that this committee has developed a promising bipartisan framework and proposals that I earnestly hope will become law. They are urgently needed to provide effective guardrails for AI systems. My name is David Evan Harris. From 2018 to 2023, I worked at Facebook and Meta on the civic integrity and responsible AI teams. In my role, I helped lead efforts to combat online election interference, protect public figures, and drive research to develop ethical AI systems and AI governance. Today, those two safety teams do not exist. In the past 2 years, there have been striking changes across the industry. Trust and safety teams have shrunk dramatically. Secrecy is on the rise, and transparency is on the decline. Since leaving Meta, I have helped craft 2 bills about deepfakes and elections in California that await the governor's signature. Working closely with policymakers in California, Arizona, and internationally, I am more convinced than ever that effective oversight of AI is possible. Today, there are 3 things that I hope you take away from my testimony. First, voluntary self-regulation does not work. Second, many of the solutions for AI safety and fairness already exist in the framework and bills proposed by the members of this committee. Third, as you said, not all the horses have left the barn. There is still time to act. Back to my first point, voluntary self-regulation is a myth. Take just one example from my time at Facebook. In 2018, the company set out to make time on their platforms into time well spent, reducing the number of viral videos and increasing more meaningful content from friends and family. The voluntary policy opened up a vacuum that TikTok was more than happy to step into. Today, Facebook and Instagram are fighting to claw back market share from TikTok with Reels, essentially those same viral videos that they sought to diminish. When one tech company tries to be responsible, another, less responsible company steps in to fill the void. While non-binding efforts such as the White House voluntary AI commitments and the AI Elections Accord are positive steps forward, the reality is that we've seen very little clear progress towards the promises made by tech companies in those commitments. When it comes to policies and laws governing AI, laws with shalls rather than mays are essential. Without the shalls, the legislation becomes voluntary, and many companies will delay or simply avoid taking meaningful actions to prioritize safety or harm reduction. To my second point, we don't need silver bullets. The framework proposed by this committee's leadership already has so many of the answers. 2 recommendations in particular in the framework are essential components for legislation. AI companies should be held liable for their products, and they should be required to embed hard-to-remove provenance data in AI-generated content. It is encouraging to see a bill on transparency in elections that would require labeling of some AI-generated material. More steps like these are needed. This brings me to my final point. The horses have not left the barn. The misconception is that it is too late to do anything. It can be dizzying to watch the fast-paced releases of AI voice and image deepfakes, but the growing role of biased AI systems making decisions about our lives. But there are still so many more uses of AI technology that have not yet seen the light of day. Next come the realistic video deepfakes, live audio deepfakes that can interact with millions of people at once, personalized election disinformation calls, large-scale automated sextortion schemes targeting children. Those are just a few of the ones that we see on the horizon. We need to move quickly with binding and enforceable oversight of AI. It is possible. If you take action now on the promising framework and bills already before you, you can rein in the Clydesdales and the Centaurs waiting just behind the barn door. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Ms. Mitchell.
Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Hawley, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Margaret Mitchell, and I'm here in my capacity as a computer scientist and researcher who has worked in the tech industry for over 10 years. My PhD is in natural language generation, once a niche area, but currently a topic of intense interest all over the world. As a student eating ramen at a state school in Washington, I couldn't imagine that my work would have the relevance that brings me here today. I've had the privilege of being a researcher at Microsoft and Google, and I'm currently chief ethics scientist at AI startup Hugging Face. I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to work with some of the world's brightest minds in pursuit of creating beneficial technology that can aid and assist people in their work and everyday lives. I began working on ethical AI around 2015 as neural networks began to show clear signs of working well for the tasks I cared about. While they could be used to provide beneficial technology, such as visual descriptions for people who are blind, they were entangled with a host of troubling issues. For example, the amount of data they required brought with it concerning questions for me about how the data was being collected and how data biases were being accounted for. These issues were difficult to address within the tech industry. It was too easy to overlook the connection between what we developed and the foreseeable harms to people once deployed. Too easy to gather more and more data while ignoring issues of consent, credit, and compensation. We were on a path of creating systems that we didn't fully understand, enabled by data sets that we hadn't critically analyzed, and motivated by evaluations that didn't critically engage with easily foreseeable contexts of use. When I joined Google in 2016, I was highly motivated to try and change this. One of the basic ideas I had was the role of foresight, of thinking through all the different ways a technology might evolve and using this to develop technology that's as beneficial as possible while mitigating foreseeable risks before they occur. But this type of thinking is difficult to incorporate into standard development practices where internal incentives push developers to launch new products quickly without productive collaboration across different ideas, viewpoints, and critiques. As I discussed these issues with my friends across the industry, it seemed this problem was common, present throughout large tech companies. Because of this, I realized that ethical AI practices could be more successful if I could turn those practices into launches. And so with my colleagues, we introduced model cards, launchable artifacts that incentivize thinking about technology's impacts, including documenting the intended use of a model and evaluating its performance across subpopulations that could foreseeably be subject to unfair treatment from an AI system. Part of my work on documentation and the role of critical thinking and foresight in development made it clear to me that there should be some amount of due diligence before a system is developed, such as research to inform predictions on what the system will be like by reviewing past literature and work from related fields. This motivated me to co-author a now famous paper called On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots: Can Language Models Be Too Big? I've since continued my work, trying to understand gaps in AI development that overlook the impacts of the technology and developing methods to address them. I've taken on new challenges in understanding when systems might be more open or more closed, and now work at AI startup Hugging Face, a company focused on open science, where I operate in a culture of transparency and collaboration across different viewpoints, and for the first time, can go deeply into how the AI world I'm most familiar with connects to AI policy. My journey has made clear some of the ways that the government might be able to help shape AI development within the tech sector so that it may be positive for the public. Briefly, this involves filling key gaps in AI development practices and research, including 1, research on the relationships between model inputs and model outputs. 2, rigorous analysis of data, models, and systems. 3, implementing due diligence and foresight, including before development. And 4, operationalizing transparency in the AI lifecycle, including after deployment. Potential solutions primarily take 2 forms: federal research funding and requiring documentation and disclosure. And I echo my colleagues here in advocating for increased support for whistleblowing. I greatly appreciate the work that so many members of Congress, congressional staff, federal agencies, and my research and private sector colleagues are doing to advance the science and practice of ethical AI. I look forward to discussing these important topics with you today and welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mitchell. Again, I want to thank all of you for your very insightful and important testimony. We're going to have 5-minute rounds of questions, and I'll begin. Mr. Saunders, Mr. Harris, you said in your testimony, quote, trust and safety teams have shrunk dramatically. Secrecy and lack of transparency have increased. Is that true across the board of all companies?
Thank you so much, Senator Blumenthal, for the opportunity to answer that question. I have appended in the appendices to my written testimony a report by an organization called the Free Press that is entitled The Big Tech Backslide. I would encourage you and your colleagues to visit this report. It's the most comprehensive study that I have seen so far about the backslide. The backslide consists in part of just removing the people from those teams. It has been reported that Elon Musk let go of 81% of the staff of Twitter after purchasing it. We saw large layoffs across the board in the entire sector, but part of the backslide is also the retreat from policies, specific policies that the companies have designed to keep our elections safe. So I do believe that I personally have observed one company that has actually made strides forward and hired many people during this same period of the past 2 years, and you're not going to like the one that it is, but it's TikTok. Honestly, TikTok has been hiring a lot of the people who were let go from many of those other companies.
But the measure of their commitment to some oversight and safeguards is their investment in that kind of, in effect, trust and safety teams, and they have been backsliding, which belies their stated commitment to trust us, we'll do it, don't worry.
Yes, perhaps because my equine metaphor resonated so much with you, I could offer it another story from the animal kingdom, but this time ursine in nature. There is a metaphor that is used in the tech industry that I know of being used in at least 2 of the very biggest tech companies, and it's called the metaphor of the bear. You, senators, are the bear in this metaphor, along with other regulatory bodies, the regulators. And the tech companies in this metaphor are people running away from the bear as fast as they can. In this story, the bear eventually catches up and it eats the slowest person, eating the slowest tech company. Thus, the moral of the story, if you are a tech company, is just don't be the second slowest. That is the strategy. So as long as you can point to someone, to another tech company that is doing a worse job than you are on trust and safety, the idea is that is the optimal allocation of resources in your company.
I think what's important here is that all of the tech companies, not just one, not just, for example, OpenAI, we're not singling out one or another, are engaged in that kind of strategy. Let me ask Ms. Toner, you wrote in your testimony that your, quote, experience on the board of OpenAI taught me how fragile internal guardrails are when money is on the line and why it's imperative that policymakers step in. I know there are limits on what you can discuss publicly. I'm very respectful of them, but maybe you can tell us what you had in mind when you wrote that sentence.
Certainly, Senator, and there's now been enough public reporting of some of the kinds of incidents that demonstrate this dynamic, including situations like a process known as the Deployment Safety Board, which was set up internally. Great idea for something to try and coordinate safety between OpenAI and Microsoft when using OpenAI products. It's now been reported publicly that In the early days of that process, Microsoft, they're in the midst of planning a very big, very important launch, the launch of GPT-4, and Microsoft went ahead and launched GPT-4 to tens of thousands of users in India without getting approval from that deployment safety board. Another example would be that there's been, since I stepped off the board, there's been concerns raised from inside the company that in the lead up to the launch of their 4.0 model, which was the the voice assistant that had very, very exciting launch videos, was launched the day before a Google event that OpenAI knew might upstage them. And there's been concerns raised from inside the company about their inability to fully carry through the kinds of safety commitments that the company had made in advance of that. So there's additional examples, but I think that those two illustrate the core point.
Thank you. Senator Durbin.
Thank you. I'm going to ask some basic questions. Liberal arts lawyer, forgive me, maybe that will lead to inspiration, I'm not sure. I'm trying to understand the mechanism of regulation in the AI venture. We look back in history to the Manhattan Project, and it was inspired by the government, funded by the government, staffed by the government, built by the government, succeeded. And I think it generally succeeded. Then you fast forward a few years to the race to the moon, and the question is, was it inspired by the government, but now do we have more private sector involved in it in terms of the actual project and its success? Then you go to the world of quantum, and let me tell you at this point, that's as far as I can go in my expertise, other than the fact that I met a man who works for DARPA who explained to me that his job is to prove that the quantum effort of a certain company, private company, doesn't work. He's supposed to prove this over and over again. His name's Peter. Very interesting guy. But it appears that that is all private sector, and we as regulators are on the outside getting ready to prove it doesn't work, hoping that someday we won't be able to prove that. So the question is now, where is AI? And can we as a government actually regulate the future of an industry unless we have a team and technology that matches what they have, or at least is close to it? It seems to me it's tough to regulate an entity if you don't understand it and the decisions that they have to make. Would anybody like to straighten me out? Please.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that the government has a really useful role to play here in incentivizing good work. So in my written testimony, I speak to how there are very clear gaps in current AI development processes within the tech industry where there just isn't enough research and there isn't enough work, and it hasn't organically emerged due to market pressures and things like that. So in particular, there isn't a really rigorous, mature science of data analysis in order to understand the relationship between inputs and outputs. We've seen in the past that there have been grants, things available through DARPA, for example, to increase the state-of-the-art in machine translation. So now it's possible to communicate with someone speaking in a different language without knowing that language. That has been partially enabled by DARPA and the grants through there. So I think that by focusing in on these sort of difficult points within the AI lifecycle where there really hasn't been development, and there should be, and I think we cover that in some of our written testimonies, the government has a very good role to play in helping make sure that AI continues to be developed in a way that's beneficial, as opposed to overlooking a lot of the serious issues.
The way you explained your background, at least I hope I caught it, you've been primarily private sector.
Yes.
So the question I'm asking you is, if the government is going to regulate you with some federal employees or contract employees, do we have the level of expertise to really interface with what you're doing in the private sector?
I think it's possible to hire for the expertise if you don't already. I mean, I will speak to that. As I've met with staff, I've been incredibly impressed by the intelligence of the people that I've operated with. So I do have some faith that the government is able to employ relevant people. I think part of the difficulty is the compensation, right? So big tech companies are offering $1 million packages. So that ends up being, I think, quite a difficult tension there. But this is a situation where you might have, individuals in government under NDA working within the company or auditing the company in some way, respecting trade secrets, IP, those kinds of things, but still being able to sort of, lift the hood and see what's happening underneath and provide feedback on it.
Anyone else want to comment on the government effort? Mr. Harris?
Yes, thank you so much for the question, Senator Durbin. I understood two different elements from your question, one being, can we actually regulate this? And two being, do we have the right people in government to do it? To the first point, I would refer you back to the excellent Blumenthal-Hawley framework that has already been presented.
I was hoping you'd say that.
It contains the key elements that I would recommend. Even if I had not read it, I would have said licensing and registration of AI systems and the companies that make them, liability, clearly holding AI companies liable for the products that they make, and provenance, giving people the ability to know what content is produced by AI and what content is produced by humans. Those are just a few pieces that are already in the framework, and I'm excited to see legislative text with the details of that. To your question about talent, this is not the first time this issue has come up in the federal government. You might recall the healthcare.gov launch, and that was,
oh yeah.
yes, that was, I believe, one of the first major public moments when people realized that it was very hard for the federal government under procurement and staffing procedures to hire the right people to launch large-scale technology projects. Now, there have been advances since then. There's something called cyberpay that allows agencies to pay a little bit more, but I don't think it's gone far enough. I think there's a situation now where one of the techniques to recruit is to find people who've already made a good amount of money in the private sector and can make a little bit less for a few years and then know they're going to go back. I don't actually think that's a long-term sustainable model. I think the rates of pay still need to go up. But I would like to call your attention to the AI Safety Institute, which exists within NIST, within the Department of Commerce, that has actually started hiring up for this task at hand. I think that there are incredible people there that need a lot more money. And I hope that you will give that to them.
Thank you.
I'm going to interrupt my second round to yield to Senator Blackburn, who has rejoined us.
Thank you so much. Yes, there are so many hearings today. It is catching us running back and forth. Mr. Saunders, to the point you were just making, one of the things we've said repeatedly is we have to have an online privacy bill that is federally preemptive before we start down the AI path, because people want to be able to firewall their information and keep it out of the public domain. And last week, and Ms. Toner, I want to come to you on this, because Meta announced it was going to use public content and things from Facebook and Instagram in the UK, and they were going to use this to train their generative AI models. And Meta said their goal was to reflect, British culture, history, and idiom, and that UK companies and institutions will be able to utilize the latest technology. And I think we all know what that means. I'd love to hear what concerns you have over that announcement and what limits should we place on companies like Meta that are using this data that is shared on their platforms to train their generative AI models.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. My understanding of that announcement, which I should admit, have seen briefly but not dug into in depth, is that that was actually a practice that Meta was already very much, going ahead with in the United States due to the lack of privacy protections here, and that the announcement last week was, I think they had
need that privacy bill.
Indeed. I believe, and other witnesses may know better, I believe that they had held off on initiating that process in the UK due to privacy protections that do exist in the UK. So to me, this is actually an example of perhaps success on the UK's part if Meta felt the need to be a little more thoughtful, a little more deliberate, a little more selective about the ways in which they were using British users' data because of the legal protections that existed there, which, as you rightly point out, do not exist in the United States. I don't know if others want to add to that.
I'm happy to add on that. There was actually something on this same topic that really got a lot of attention at the beginning of the summer. A lot of users of Facebook and Instagram found that they could opt out of the process of having their public data used for training of AI systems. And then they posted instructions. I saw this on both TikTok and on LinkedIn. Users had posted instructions how to go to the part of your Facebook or Instagram settings where you can opt out of having your data used. I tried to do it in Facebook, I tried to do it in Instagram, and I couldn't find the button. And then I posted and said, I can't find the button in the comments there, and it turned out everyone with their IP address in the United States couldn't find the button, because this was a feature that I believe was only offered to people in the EU and perhaps in the UK. I heard different stories about which parts of the world. But this idea that we Americans are second-class citizens, that we don't even have the right to object, that Europeans or people in the UK have to object to our photos of ourselves, photos of our families, of our children being used to train AI systems, and at that AI systems that we don't even have confidence in how they work. We don't know if they will accidentally release personal information about us in the future, make images that look just like us. So I applaud you for raising this issue, and I'm excited to see bills like APRA make progress so that we have the foundations of a legal system that can address that issue.
Well, we think having an online privacy, federally preemptive privacy bill that gets signed into law is something that is going to be necessary. And as Senator Blumenthal said in his opening remarks, and I'm paraphrasing him now, but basically big tech has proven to us they are not going to take steps that are necessary to protect the information.
Thank you very much, Senator Blackburn. A number of you have mentioned whistleblowers and the need for protecting them. Maybe anyone who would like could expand on that point. You are all insiders who have left companies or disassociated yourself with them in one way or another, and I'd be interested in your thoughts. Mr. Saunders?
Yeah. Thank you, Senator. So when I resigned from OpenAI, I sort of found that they gave to every departing employee a restrictive non-disparagement agreement, and you would lose all of the equity you had in the company if you didn't sign this agreement, where you had to effectively not criticize the company and not tell anybody that you'd signed this agreement. And I think this really opened my eyes to the kinds of legal situation that employees face if they want to talk about problems at the company. And I think there's a number of important things that employees want in this situation. So there's knowing who you can talk to. It's very unclear sort of what parts of the government would have expertise in specific kinds of issues. You want to know, and you want to know that you're going to talk to somebody who understands the issues that you have, and that has some ability to act on them. And then you also want legal protections, and this is where I think it's important to define protections that don't just apply when there's a suspected violation of law, but when there's a sort of suspected harm or risk imposed on society. And so that's why I think legislation needs to include establishing whistleblower points of contact and these protections.
Other thoughts, Ms. Mitchell?
Yeah, thank you. So I think Mr. Saunders is making one of the really important points here is that there just isn't a lot of knowledge about when and how to whistleblow. So as part of my sort of ethics studies, I tried to familiarize myself with the situation where you would whistleblow versus whether this would be breaking your NDA, that sort of thing. This is something that I had to learn myself, and ideally I would have had some sort of resource. Ideally there's some agency you could call and say, hey, theoretically, if I think there's an issue, now what do I do, right? But essentially, if you're considering whistleblowing, it's you and you alone against, a company making a ton of money with lawyers who are set up to harm you if you make the smallest move incorrectly, whatever it is. And so I think that it needs to be very clear to people working internally when and how to whistleblow, and it needs to be very clear at the highest levels of the company that that is supported. I could even imagine having orientations where you're required to provide information on whistleblowing, that kind of thing. But currently, there's no information internally, and you're very much on your own in a situation where you might lose your job and then not have the money to pay for a lawyer to fight it.
Ms. Toner?
Thank you. Just to put a finer point on something that I think both Mr. Saunders and Dr. Mitchell are describing, I think a core to the problem here is that the lack of regulation on tech means that many of these concerning practices are not illegal. And so existing whistleblower protections, it's very unclear if they apply at all. And if you're a whistleblower, a potential whistleblower sitting inside one of these companies, you don't really want to go out on a limb and take a guess at, well, is this enough of a financial issue that the SEC would cover me, or do I have to go talk? If it's something that's kind of novel, related to AI development or other technology development, where you have serious concerns, but there's not a clear statute on the book saying the company is breaking the law, then your options are limited. So I think the need for whistleblower protections goes hand in hand with the lack of other rules.
So I think the point that you've just made is really important, that the failure to develop safety and control features in a product is not illegal, perhaps, and therefore may not be covered by a strict reading of whistleblower laws, even if it is a practice which is unethical and harmful. I think that's a very important point. Let me sort of go to the other side of that question, which is the incentives, whether promotion or compensation, bonuses, and other kinds of incentives that are offered by the company. Do they align with safety? For example, are employees rewarded for developing better safety features, or is it more rewards for racing to the market, which is the dynamic that we've discussed today? Mr. Harris, or Mr. Saunders? Mr. Harris?
Yeah, I could share an anecdote about that, Senator Blumenthal. Early in my tenure at Facebook, I was introduced to someone who was a friend of a friend, and I told them that I had joined the civic integrity team. And this person said, "Oh, that work sounds so interesting, but I just never joined teams like that because you can never show impact. You never have anything to say on your performance reviews about what you did, because the only thing you achieved was hopefully to not have something happen." And I heard different versions of that throughout my time in the tech industry, not just from inside of the companies where I worked, but I heard that across the board. It's very hard to make progress in your career when you work in an area that doesn't have clear ways to show progress. I also heard of people being asked whether they could demonstrate that work that they did reduced the number of public relations emergencies for the company. How can you possibly demonstrate that you reduced the number of public relations emergencies for a company? So again, these are structural problems with doing that work, and I applaud you for bringing up that question.
Thank you. Mr. Saunders.
Yeah. So I think there were, a couple of significant goals that OpenAI as an organization has. So one of these is called maintaining research velocity. And so, on things like security, OpenAI is reluctant to do things that will, require additional work from researchers or might slow them down to use a more secure system. And then, on more of the testing side, there's often, release dates that are set where the company starts, talking to a bunch of, customers and saying oh yes, we're going to ship by this date. And then sort of the amount of safety work is, determined after picking how quickly you want to ship, and subject to office politics, and these kinds of things. And so this is because companies just face an enormous incentive to be seen as the company that's leading in the AI space. And so this is why we need to have, there needs to be some kind of, regulation to be like doing the right thing, because otherwise it's going against the grain.
I'll give Ms. Toner and Ms. Mitchell a chance to respond as well, if you have any responses. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I echo my co-witnesses. We used to sort of, I've previously sort of realized that it's difficult to get promoted if you focus on safety, this kind of thing, because you're not promoted for the bad headlines that never exist, right? And so you're trying to prove something that never actually happened. And this also speaks to the role of foresight and why foresight isn't incentivized. Because if you take these extra steps to make sure that something bad doesn't happen, you can't prove that it could have happened. So there's really, it's really quite difficult to focus on safety and ethics and these kinds of things. In general, your promotional velocity is much less compared to your peers, which also means that you are less likely to become a leader at the company in order to further set norms. So by focusing on things like safety and ethics, it's a way to sort of remain at the lower levels of a company and not be able to fundamentally shape it for the better.
We've seen examples already of our foreign adversaries using AI to meddle in our democracy. I think last month, OpenAI revealed that the Iranian government link group had used ChatGPT to create content for social media and blogs attempting to sow division and push Iran's agenda in the United States. There have been reports that China and Russia have also used AI tools deceptively to interfere in our democracy. I mentioned them earlier. I think the threat to our elections is real, and we're unprepared. Mr. Harris, you worked on a California law that seeks to safeguard our democracy. Are those the kinds of protections that you think would be effective at the federal level? And is there more that you would add to the California law?
Thank you so much for the question, Senator. I believe that in California, it's difficult to make a lot of types of laws that could be made at the federal level. There are a number of reasons for that. One is simply the state agency infrastructure is dramatically smaller than the federal agency infrastructure. And in California, in a situation of budget deficit, it's very hard right now to pass any legislation that has any significant cost. That, I believe, is one of the biggest barriers to passing the legislation that we need. And I think that you have in front of you in your framework the type of legislation that California would not be able to achieve. Things like licensing and registration and liability, those would be very costly at the scale of a state to enforce those. And to be honest, it would, of all the states in the country, maybe be one that cost California more than many others simply because of the location of the technology industry there. And there might be political conditions that make it harder in California to pass that type of legislation.
Again, I'll entertain any points about the California law that any of you would like to make. And if not, let me follow up, Mr. Harris. In your experience there, what was your takeaway from the tech companies? Were they supportive, helpful? How would you characterize their reaction?
Thank you so much for the question. I believe that you need to look at two different phenomena. One is the outward presentation of the tech companies about legislation, and then another is what's happening behind closed doors. I made a reference in my opening statement to the idea of shalls and mays. I was surprised. I have been surprised in my work in the California legislature by the way in which tech industry lobbyists, sometimes hiding behind industry groups, sometimes from individual named companies, are able to arrive at legislators' doors with requests to remove shalls and replace them with mays, to take legislative language that was very well-intentioned and at the 11th hour turn it into something that is meaningless. It concerns me greatly, what I've seen in California. There are political realities that if draft legislation that comes from a civil society group like the one that I have been working for, the California Initiative for Technology and Democracy, that if those pieces of legislation are too bold, sponsors of that legislation, organizational sponsors, will be told this isn't going to work and you're going to have to weaken it. And sometimes that comes in many rounds of weakening, and it can be very painful to watch.
There are two studies. You mentioned a study, Mr. Harris, which we will put in the record along with your testimony. I want to mention two others. A Stanford Internet Observatory report this past December that found that the training data sets used by AI companies are filled with thousands of known images of child sexual abuse. Possessing that kind of material is a crime, and as you wrote, Dr. Mitchell, in your testimony, training AI with these kinds of abusive materials means there's a good chance that the model will generate new abuse material. The second study is a survey released last month by the anti-exploitation group Thorn. 1 in 10 preteens and teens reported that their friends or classmates had used AI tools to generate sexual images of other kids. 1 in 10 preteens and teens saying they'd use these tools to generate sexual images of their peers. So these new AI tools, which are trained on child sexual exploitation, are fostering sexual harassment of young people, and the apps to create that abuse material are easy, they're free to find on Google and Apple app stores right now. Possessing and creating child abuse material, clear example of the problems with this race to the market, which can easily turn into a race to the bottom. There must be steps that generative AI companies can be taking to make sure their tools aren't being trained on illegal child exploitation material and aren't creating these kinds of abusive images of anyone, let alone kids. Would you agree? And what kinds of steps should these companies be taking?
Yes, thanks for the question. So this speaks to a few different issues that I think I also hit on in my written testimony. So one is just how data analysis is really not a norm within AI culture generally. And so we don't really understand when we're training a model what might be in the data. And part of my work has actually tried to invent methods in order to probe data sets, in order to figure out possible problematic content. And it falls on deaf ears. There really isn't an interest in it. So I think that work that can further incentivize this, I think NIST and the USAA Safety Institute probably have a very clear role to play here in helping us understand what the contents of the data are and further providing mechanisms for people to actually do this in a lawful way in order to really understand the contents. I'll also add, this is just sort of insider knowledge that might be useful for you to know. A lot of the data that ends up being used in machine learning systems are collected via an organization called Common Crawl. I do wonder if there might be room for the government to help Common Crawl to analyze the data before it's released at all, which would stop the further proliferation right where it starts. And the last part I want to make is this is also where watermarking and provenance information is really key, including invisible watermarking, which is open research, but something that would be very, very helpful in order to trace back where this came from.
If I could add, Senator Blumenthal?
Absolutely.
So yes, I agree with the statements that you made, and I think there are a few lessons that we should learn from this current situation. One is, again, voluntary self-regulation does not work. There is another public statement about this topic that was signed by a number of companies that signed on to what Thorne and All Tech is Human, another tech nonprofit, called the Safety by Design Principles. And amongst the signers to that were included Stability AI, I believe Hugging Face, another company called Civit AI, and they signed this and made agreements about doing things to prevent the use of child sexual abuse material in AI models. Now, the problem is that that report that you referred to from the Stanford Internet Observatory, that was released in December. But until just a few weeks ago, there had been no moves to actually take down the offending AI models in any serious way. A few weeks ago, when I was on the eve of publishing a paper on this topic with IEEE Spectrum, a technology publication, I reached out to those companies and perhaps in response to my outreach, perhaps not, one of the companies involved, Runway ML, the company that people point to as being responsible for training Stable Diffusion 1.5, the specific model trained on thousands of images of CSAM, they actually removed their Hugging Face repository. Now, the problem with removing a repository, this was an open source AI model, the problem with removing it is that there were many other versions of that model that are still hosted on Hugging Face, and my co-panelist, Dr. Mitchell, is appearing here in her individual capacity, and I have immense respect for her research and do not expect her to feel the need to speak up on behalf of or in response to my statements here. But Hugging Face has chosen not to take down other versions of Stable Diffusion 1.5. Another company called Civit AI has a website with many, many models derived from Stable Diffusion 1.5, perhaps the original model itself or something close to it. They also choose not to take it down. And these are the open source models that are likely behind. The report that I shared with you from Graphica that will also go into the record states that a big reason for the rise of these undressing or nudifying apps is the advancement of open source AI image generation tools. And until we can get the companies that are hosting these tools to take just the minimum level of responsibility. I mean, I've done content moderation before. I've worked on this issue. If something is called Stable Diffusion 1.5, Stanford says that was trained on child sexual abuse material, why let someone upload something called Stable Diffusion 1.5 today? After it was taken down, more people uploaded dozens more versions of it.
Great. Any other comments on that question? Dr. Mitchell.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to follow up with you if that's the case. I wasn't aware of that. So that's very important information for me to know. So yeah, I mean, this is a serious concern, and I think this is part of why we need the government's help in order to be able to even search for these things, right? So there are techniques you can use to try and understand if there might be an issue, and I won't detail them here because of potential malicious actors watching. I can follow up with you privately. But trying to specifically identify the content, I think, breaks several laws. So you end up in a weird sort of bind where you have to try and see if it's there, but you can't really see if it's there. And then it ends up with potentially censoring some content that really shouldn't be censored. So it is really, really difficult, and we could use the government's help on this directly.
I'm not suggesting that it's a simple issue, but there is a need for action, and I think all of you have made the point that we can't rely on the companies alone to take action because of the incentives that they have and that they communicate to their employees, which are get to the market as soon as possible, and let's worry about hindsight afterward. Someone mentioned open source. Is that a consideration for us? What should we think about open source in this context of protecting the public? Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you. Yeah, and so this is something that I actually work on, within my professional capacity. So there's this term open source that I think is used a lot without fully understanding what it means. It's also used, I think, in situations where it doesn't necessarily apply. The thing to recognize is that there's a gradient of openness, that you can have things that are more open or less open depending on foreseeable risks. So, for example, one of the things I've been involved with at Hugging Face is implementing gating, such that you can't access a model, you can't access a data set unless you've provided personal information, unless you've taken a training and can show the certificate, that kind of thing. And so there's an entire spectrum from fully closed to fully open, where I think we can do a lot of really good work depending on the specific foreseeable problematic uses of different models and data sets.
If I could?
Sure.
So I've written extensively on this topic of open source, and I think there are a number of important points. The first one that I would like to caution you of in advance is that in the European Union, in the lead up to the signing and the finalization of the EU AI Act, a number of companies pushed very, very hard to get full exemptions for open source AI from the provisions of the EU AI Act. I would expect, if I were in your position, that you will receive these types of requests here if you have not already. Exempting open source AI from AI regulation is not appropriate. That's because once you release an open AI system, some people now, even including in the federal government, are using a different term, open weights. That's perhaps a more appropriate term. The executive order on AI uses the term dual-use models, foundation models with widely available model weights. There's a lot of terminology issues here. I'll go with open weights, because I think that's the clearest one right now. Also, unsecured is a way to think about it. So when you release open weights, unsecured models, you never get them back. If they're trained on thousands of images of CSAM and they can produce CSAM, child sexual abuse material, you will never retrieve that. It will live on. You can do things to make it hide out in only the hidden corners of the internet. You can make it less available. And that's the case with all of these open weights or unsecured models. And unfortunately, we've seen a number of companies take that strategy without doing significant safety testing on models. And that's why I'm very concerned about this, and I believe there should be no exemptions to any AI laws for open weights or unsecured AI systems.
You know, just a few questions in closing. One of the arguments that we hear in this realm, as well as many others, is regulation will inhibit innovation, or regulation will impede our competition with our adversaries, China being one. We've had some questions about China. Should we be concerned about impeding innovation or putting companies in this country at a disadvantage with efforts abroad? I think that's a question I'd like to ask all of you. Ms. Toner?
Certainly happy to begin. I think it's a question that is worth your consideration and should certainly factor heavily into how regulation is designed and how Congress makes decisions about what legislation to pass. But I think it is used as a catch-all rejection of any kind of regulation, and I think that that is mistaken. I think it's mistaken for a few reasons. Primary among them that there are many, many kinds of regulation, and some of them inhibit innovation quite a lot. Certainly poorly designed, heavy-handed regulation can do that. But plenty of kinds of regulation do the opposite. So, one example is there were, my understanding is in maybe the 70s or 80s, there were rule changes around, maybe more recently, there were rule changes in the financial sector around who was responsible for credit card fraud that made the banks, have to foot the bill if cards were used fraudulently. And one significant result of that regulation was significant innovation in credit card security and different mechanisms to reduce the chances of that fraud. So that's a regulation that both protected consumers and also directly spurred innovation. I think a mechanism that to me seems very important for AI that I mentioned before and can elaborate on a little is this idea of consumer trust or consumer willingness to use this technology, to rely on this technology, not just consumers, also businesses, enterprise use of AI. Right now, we're in a state where people don't actually trust this technology. They don't have the experience that it's particularly reliable or that it necessarily, has results that fall within their expectations, and that makes them less willing to use it, which means the companies are earning less revenue, which means that they're less able to reinvest that revenue in research. So I think there are examples in, food safety is an area. We're very fortunate in this country that, we have to think almost not at all about the safety of our food going from day to day because we have such good food safety standards. And I think, the AI is very, very far from that point. So I think, in my mind, almost all of the policy recommendations that have been made today are the kinds of recommendations that really would not inhibit innovation at all, and in some cases might actively promote it.
I think these points are very, very important. If there's a disaster on AI, it's equivalent to a food company, taking the issue of food safety, having a major outbreak of listeria, food poisoning. It has to recall products, its credibility is undermined, it's a major marketing disaster. And this kind of AI catastrophe would impact not only that company, but possibly others as well. So there's a very rational and powerful argument for regulation that makes sure that everybody is abiding by common sense, rational standards that are good for the industry. And the idea of some certainty, one after another for 20, 30 years, businesses have told me, give us the rules. We may disagree with you, but just tell us the rules and don't change them from year to year. We need some stability. We can work with whatever rules you give us, but we need to know what they are, and they need to be clear, and they need to be stable. And frankly, I take them at their word because I think, again, in their rational interest, that ought to be their attitude unless we do something crazy. Nobody here wants to do something crazy because we recognize the immense good that can come from AI. And this goes back to the point that you made, Ms. Toner, that it would be easy to say, let's ban AI. But it has enormous potential for good. Take the medical area. The potential for research as well as for treatment and diagnosis, immense. And it's a little bit like, and forgive me for being oversimplistic, but I've been doing some reading on COVID, the origins of COVID. The debate about, did it start in a lab? Was there a release? Was there research that tried to develop a more potent, evil virus, or did it come from the wild? At this point, we don't know. At least there are equally, or I shouldn't say equally, there are theories that have credibility that argue for all of it. But we do know that there are dangers in research on gain of function, trying to develop more lethal viruses. Now, the argument for that research is, then we'll know how to deal with them. The argument against it is, why would you develop a virus that is more destructive and damaging? The argument is not exactly the same. It's analogous, not the same. But with every advance in technology, there are also potential downsides. And the point here is to deal with the downsides and not rely only on the creators to oversee what they're doing, but impose some rules of the road that protect them and the industry as well as the public. And I think you have been enormously enlightening today to us. I hope we can continue this conversation because our goal is to achieve the promise with what you have called, Ms. Toner, a light touch. We won't all agree on what a light touch is, but if we are honest with each other, I think we can develop some standards as well as enforcement mechanisms that make sure that we impose accountability as well as criteria for judging whether or not a particular form of AI is safe and effective. just as we would impose that standard on new drug development. Safety and efficacy are the standard for the FDA. I am not going to ask you the $64 billion question, when will we have generative AI that is as smart as people? Unless you want to answer that question. I'll open the floor to you if you would like to give us your prediction, because that's a horses out of the barn issue in a sense. Once it's there and we don't have standards, you know, it's going to be put on the market. So maybe you want to address it. You don't have to. Mr. Saunders.
Yeah. I think there's. Yeah, I think when I thought about this, there was like a, you know, at least a 10% chance of something that, you know, could be catastrophically dangerous within about 3 years. And I think, you know, a lot of people inside of OpenAI also, you know, would talk about similar things. And then I think, you know, without knowing the exact details, right, like it's probably going to be longer. I think, you know, that I did not feel comfortable continuing to work for an organization that wasn't going to like take that seriously and do as much work as possible to deal with that possibility. And I think we should figure out regulation to prepare for that, because I think, you know, again, if it's not 3 years, it's going to be 5 years or 10 years. You know, this stuff is coming down the road, and we need to have some guardrails in place.
I'm happy to answer that one.
Mr. Harris.
Thank you so much. I think the good news I have for you is that the answer to that question might not be that important for you. The reason I say that is that my background working on AI is in other areas, not about artificial general intelligence, but about AI and bias, AI and deepfakes in elections, and more recently, AI and harm to children. That said, I'm lucky to have an excellent colleague at UC Berkeley, Stuart Russell, who's also appeared before this committee. Stuart has invited me to a couple of his conferences of his lab, where I am in a room surrounded by hundreds of people with computer science degrees, PhDs, who've dedicated their lives and their careers to stopping artificial intelligence from eliminating our species. It was a little bit difficult for me, trained as a sociologist, to decide where I came down on this issue. But as the conversation moved to policy and what policies we need, what I found was that there was almost no disagreement between me thinking about the problems that I've focused on in my work and theirs. The same issues, liability, licensing, registration, many of them are also actually quite concerned about deep fakes and deception, so provenance. Those key solutions are the solutions that we need to address the issues of AI bias, discrimination, disinformation, interference in elections, harm to children, and the specter of AI, artificial general intelligence or super intelligent AI being abused by bad actors to harm us in catastrophic ways.
Dr. Mitchell.
Thanks, appreciate it. So I think it's useful for me to say, as someone who works on AI, who has done a lot of work on rigorous evaluation, this sort of thing, I don't know what it means for an AI system to have human-level intelligence. What I do understand that I think is related is to have a system that can do well on a lot of different tasks that are also important for people, that people also do, those kinds of comparisons. I think we make a mistake when we group everything together and say this is basically like humans. And I want to say that I think the enterprise of AGI might be inherently problematic when it's not focusing on what the specific tasks that the systems should be solving are. So while there's been an interest in AGI so that lots of different things might be done, it might be beneficial to think about what those specific things are and creating task-built models for those specific tasks. And that way we have a lot more control over what's happening. We can do much more rigorous analysis of input and outputs. We keep things closed within the specific domains where a system is meant to be helpful.
I think Mr. Harris, you're absolutely right. It isn't that important, and it shouldn't be that important, because right now we're seeing some of the abuses and the problems, so we need to act right now. And if someone were to say, well, you don't have to worry about it for 5 or 10 years, I wouldn't believe that person anyway, because the consequences of getting it wrong are so disastrous that we should be doing it right now. It's like saying, well, we don't have to worry about an outbreak of the next pandemic because, you know, it won't happen for 100 years, like the flu didn't happen for 100 years after the last pandemic. Well, but it could have happened 10 years. It could have happened 5 years afterward. And we live in a world where the disasters seem to be happening more often, as in climate change and so forth. So I'm going to have to close the hearing. I regret that I do have to close the hearing because I'm learning a lot. I hope my colleagues have learned a lot. I hope to continue this conversation. It is immensely important. And I thank you all for your good work, for the perspective that you brought to us as insiders who have seen this issue firsthand and have chosen to give us the benefit of your perspective. And thank you all. This hearing is adjourned.